Okay, so I'm doing something completely different in that I'm kind of tying the two ideas together. In that I'm trying to look at repeated messages, so when I'm using social media, whether it's a blog or a podcast or a Twitter or anything like that, the same ideas of me, because that's what I'm kind of selling is me, are repeated. But I'm also, to quote Andrea, I'm trying to engage with platforms that people are already using. So one of the things we found out in our social media research is that you can't give someone a new site to use necessarily because they have to work it into their own program. So part of it is about connecting with what they already connect with. There's no point inventing a new way of sharing, which we found out by having a message board, because they won't engage with it, so they engage in their own. So the question that I'm here to kind of ask you is, who is you? So do you want to be a big organization, not a big organization, I mean like that. Do you want to be a big project? Do you want to be an individual? Who do you want to talk to? And when we go into the practical session, it's kind of understanding who you is in that regard. And I suppose if you're looking at these things, why would people follow you? The you that you're presenting, because it's not necessarily who you are as an individual. And why would they trust you? Because if they're going to give up their time to engage in a blog, then they need to know the blog's going to be there regularly so that they can go and visit it. If it occurs sporadically and it's not very current, or it's not following through, or they click on a link and it doesn't work, then they get frustrated and they need to trust you in terms of how you take those processes forwards. And the question that I would ask is, why would they bring you into their professional learning network? And if you don't know what a PLN is, this is a term that's used on social media, and it basically means, my graphics has gone swapping computers, learners create connections and develop a network that contributes to their professional development and knowledge. This is people investing their own time to invest in you. So whether it's your research or how you're branding it, they're using their time. They're not doing something else in order to engage with you. So why would they do that? Why would they bring you into that community? And this is one of the things that you have to ask yourself when you're using social media or digital presence, is why do people going to trust you and your ideas? So I suppose the example is, who is me? So what do I present when I came in? My background is I was a former teacher, and I had to decide what I was going to be. Now, the one thing I didn't want to be was an ivory tower dweller. I didn't want to take on, and start to use big language. And when I blog and when I podcast, I'm very careful not to use academic language because it puts practitioners off. So your audience don't want to hear about epistemologies or ontologies. They want to hear actually what you mean by those processes. And so that language is very, very important. But nor did I want to just be an XP teacher. It would have given me a lot of social capital with my audience, but it wouldn't necessarily position me. So I kind of went for a hybrid, which was a practitioner researcher who talks about research-informed teaching. But I also wanted to be a practitioner researcher who engages in teaching-informed research. So I'm trying to do work with teachers who are my key demographic, I suppose, if you want to look at an audience, and actually use teaching that I've done and they've done to begin to put a message across in terms of how it's coherent and how they talk to each other. So I came up with this. My wife likes to call me Drash, but that's where I was. It was kind of a hybrid of the two, and this is what I came up with. This is my bio. So when you're presenting yourself, the first thing they're going to see is you, and the second thing they're going to see who you're purporting to be. And this was me. And this is my bio that I put up on the first day I used Twitter, and it's over nearly 5 years later, it's still the same bio. This is the message that I committed to and have tried to live up to in terms of the process forward. So it's kind of maintaining an image or the you that you want to show to people, and it's how you develop that. And we're going to go now into some practical sessions, and I'm aware that we're slightly behind time, so I'm doing this quite quickly because I'm on again later. But when you go into these sessions, I think it's very important that you think about who you is. Is you a project? Is you an idea? Is you a person? And then you begin to look at those in terms of the way you take it forward. And as I do these things, as I said before, I try to make sure that message is consistent, that they're investing in my case, they're investing in me. So I have a certain trust element, and then from there, different things occur, which allows me to do other things. And it goes across multiple platforms, as I'll talk about later. Okay, so we'll crack on, as they say. Okay, so I'm going to talk about my uses of Twitter as an academic, and I'm going to particularly, I tend to use the Twitter app in terms of what I'm doing, and what I'm going to talk about now is, I'm going to go through a presentation that I developed for my postgraduate students. I work in teacher education, so this is kind of a presentation for postgraduate students on how they might use Twitter professionally. And we talk about who do they want to be on Twitter, and one of the questions I tend to ask them is, would you be happy for your grandmother to follow you and understand what you're saying on Twitter? Because if not, and you have as a professional in education, then you've probably got the wrong sort of Twitter account. So the idea of this is it's not supposed to be voiced, so I'm going to stand back and just click through it because it's supposed to stand alone, and if I narrate it, it takes far too long. So, and there may be some formatting problems, I'll say that as well, when it's swapped computers. I'm supposed to say hashtag. I say the formatting, it's much better on the original. Now these hashtags are very specific to PE, but I'll give you an example of the ones that we would use. Create your own crowd. So, this was designed specifically just to be something that I could give to my students as a way of beginning to understand what Twitter was about. And some of the messages were around the different types of things that you would do, and hashtags are particularly important in terms of how you find your networks. But it's also how you find people. If you can do a search for a hashtag, so in my case, the whole idea of PE geeks, PE and geeks doesn't normally go together, jocks and geeks. So the idea was that somebody 5 years ago designed this idea of the PE geek. He has actually self-styled himself as a PE geek, as an Australian PE teacher who designs his own apps, and he uses them in his classroom. But that PE geek is extended to PE geeks, and now it's kind of a catchphrase that we use. Also, it's quite short. We use phys ed. We don't use PE because it means something completely different in somewhere else. So sometimes when you're looking to create hashtags, you have to search to make sure no one else is using them. But there are hashtags that will exist within your community. They might be, Bases might have one in terms of, being a hashtag that exists that's already there. But often conferences have hashtags, and these are ways to begin to find people who are talking about what you're talking about. So sometimes it's finding someone to follow, and then finding the hashtags that they use. And then following the hashtags to find out what other people are saying about these things. And beginning to build your community from that point forward.
You're literally just searching in the Twitter account. So
yeah.
You're using the search box in your Twitter account, so you set that up first.
Yeah. So I'm going to borrow your account. So if I come into here and I use an Apple keyboard. Where's hashtag? It's there, it's not there. So, where's the laser? There. So in the box up here, you start with a hashtag. And if I hashtag physed and do a search, it should bring up people using physed. And it tends to search it by top tweeters and all. So just the top search in itself can bring in some of the people. I mean, Andy Vasili is a Canadian who works in China. So he works in an international school in China. Nathan is an Australian who works in Singapore. These are guys who are, fairly influential. Nick is an American, I believe. Jo is English. She works in America. Amanda's Canadian. So you begin. I mean, these are people who I know very, very well in terms. I've not met many of them. I've met Jo, but these are people who talk within my community an awful lot. So these are the hashtags they're using. So there's phys ed here. There's health ed coming in here. So you can begin to pick out different hashtags. So hashtag sport would probably be a fairly big one, and you'd probably find a lot of people, but you'd probably find a fairly generic one. So sometimes it's linking those gaps together. I mean, you can search in that box for specific phrases. So if there's a phrase or a catchphrase that's used a lot in your community, you can search for that. You can search for individuals by name. If you have a very uncommon name, then you'll tend to get a lot. If you search for John Smith, then it's very, very difficult. So sometimes it's finding out from people, and then it's working on their communities. The other way to do it is, if you find somebody, so this is the conversation back on Twitter. I wasn't going to do this, but so no notifications. These are people who are talking about this and mentioning you. Now that's interesting because this guy is a UK PE teacher, and he follows me. So by me following someone else, that appears on somebody else's feed. So you begin to get that interconnection in terms of how the processes work. But if we pick out me as an example, then one way I use, if I want to follow someone, I see who they're following. So if I click on my followers, but I'm not using my account, then it will bring up all the people I'm following. So that then becomes almost a reference list for going down and picking out key players. So it's about using hashtags, using people and beginning to create sort of the network in that way.
To show a photo of yourself talking about Twitter, you should get the information like right now.
Yeah, I did tweet about me talking about Twitter.
I just tweeted about you.
About me or about this? Because I'm not in my account.
About you.
Okay, I don't. Well, oops. Because I'm not in my account, so I'm not sure if I can.
Oh, you're not.
No, I've borrowed design and digital world.
I use that too.
All right. Okay. So if I, hang on. Right. If I go home. Oh, there we go. So, yeah. So you begin to pick up. Now we need a hashtag. We need a hashtag. Do we? It's too long. Too many characters. So we have to work on that one. But hashtags are really important. Other people's followers and those sorts of things become significant. That's where I was. Okay, so, and again, this presentation is on a site called SlideShare. Help me. So because it's on SlideShare, I want to know, I want to know where I am and what I'm doing. So I'm making very deliberate connections between my various things, and that's important. So different sites are keeping that notion of who you are, or in my case, who me is. And again, just reiterating some of those hashtags. And this is physical education specific, but it maps across. So what I'm going to talk about is research, because we're researchers, and part of this process to me is how do I begin to develop my research profile as an early career academic. And And I'm going to talk about three things. We'll talk about published research and what I do with that, and how I use social media, particularly Twitter, in order to sort of market that. My presented work, so when I go to conferences, what I do with that process, and also my reflected work. So some of the work I'm doing around about research in terms of tying these all together. And as I said earlier, my bio as a practitioner researcher engaged is in teaching informed research. And part of that is, so what am I publishing? And this is this is Taylor and Francis. This is a journal that I'm an associate editor on. Its impact factor is about 1. In some fields that's quite small, in education that's quite good. And in the most read, I have a paper featuring. Now, I've only been in academia for 5 years. So in this journal, I'm featuring as one of the most read papers. Here, and this is the paper. It was published in 2011. So it's only been out there for 3 years, and it's already one of the most read. Not one of the most cited. That's the next step. And I do have a paper that is the most cited on a different journal, and I didn't bring that one up. So that's a good indicator. So when I publish a paper, I talk about it. When I get my free e-prints from Taylor and Francis, I send them out through Twitter. For a while, my paper was, because it was being talked about on social media, it then became free to look at for a month, because Taylor and Francis used it as an example. So then it got free access. So then again, you get another mechanism for doing it. Now, if that was one paper, then I'd say that I was pretty lucky. But I have a second paper, which is on a different journal as one of their most read. And I have a third paper, which is their most read. Now, I'd like to think I'm a good academic, but I don't think it's coincidental that I'm talking about my work on social media, and therefore it's beginning to get some of these processes going. So I have, in 5 years, 3 papers that are the most read on these journals. Now, it's not Nature, and it's not some of those things, but in my field, these are fairly influential journals, and yet my name is appearing there as still an early career researcher. And I put a lot of that down to not just Twitter, but my digital presence and people being aware of who I am and what I'm doing, and in some respects, trusting me. So part of this process is across 5 years, it's very difficult to make yourself up in that regard. You have to be fairly consistent. I personally think there's a direct correlation between having an audience who trust you and interested in the work that you do, who then are more likely to follow the links. Now, the second thing I talk about is presentations. Now, we often spend lots of money going to conferences. Even UK conferences, you're spending 300 or 400 quid plus accommodation and travel, and then you're spending your personal money. Tends to be in probably some of the key aspects, which is the socializing and the networking and those sorts of things. And what's the payback? Well, I use SlideShare. Now, SlideShare is another device. And I did copy these quite deliberately. So SlideShare, and again, I'm trying to repeat the image. So I'm using the same idea. So on my LinkedIn, on my Google Plus, everything else, it's the same me. So I'm trying to get that process. So when Ines was talking about using the sun, then it comes on different things. So people begin to connect. If I use different photographs on every single one, yes, it still looks like me, but you're not necessarily using the same processes. And it's not a particularly great photograph, but it's a headshot and it works, so that's fine. But I went to I've done it 3 times. I did a keynote in Turkey. I did that presentation you've just seen, and I did another one in the US. And they have this every day, the top SlideShare. I've had 3 of them. Now, again, it's not necessarily the quality of the presentations, it's about getting that process going, and this is something free. So this presentation that you saw went up 2 years ago, and it's been viewed 16,000 times. So I can't guarantee they've been through the whole presentation, but the idea is it's quite short and sharp. It doesn't need a narrative. It's been downloaded 110 times. So there's an impact of a presentation. So the investment of time begins to pay itself back. I presented this at ARA, and they were in the American Education Research Conference, and it was in the Physical Education SIG, and there were 35 people there. And we fly around the world, or we go to various places, and we present to small audiences. That was 7 months ago. It's had 10,000 views and 500 downloads. Now, this paper is currently in review, but I already have a critical mass of interest in those ideas. So then, when I publish the research, hopefully, when I publish the research, then I already have a trail in terms of what's happening. So not only have I gone to Philadelphia and presented a paper, I now have a much broader impact in terms of the way that's going. And this presentation itself has led to a trip in the summer to the States to do a keynote, another trip, another invitation, 2 other invitations in the UK to do keynotes around this idea. So it's people being aware.
2 questions. First, so you're okay with putting this stuff out there before you published on it?
Yeah, because if you look at a presentation,
You can get everything, yeah.
you can get enough, but you can get enough of the idea to understand what I'm talking about. And actually, I'm talking about that we need to have pedagogies that relate to technology. So when we bring technology into the classroom, we don't just bring it in. We use it for a purpose that develops. So Fulham would suggest that pedagogy is the driver, technology is the accelerator. Now that's a message I want to get out there, because lots of people, on my streams, it's how can I use an iPad app in my lesson? Well, that's not necessarily, is not conducive to learning. The paper is the same idea, but now discussed in much more detail. It's much more refined. It's aimed at a little more of an academic audience.
And what about, do you think this only works in terms of creative presentations? Would you stay away from putting up more academic style presentations?
This is an academic paper. As you saw from when I sent you the slides, I tend to use very image-rich, text-reduced presentations that take a lot of time to develop.
You can put posters.
But yeah,
Do you see more boring presentations up there? Do they get the same sort of
No.
attention or not?
No. But again, it's who your audience is, and it's how you're selling the. So if your audience is, so if you go to, I go to academic conferences and I see very dry, dull, boring presentations, and I don't like sitting in them. I have no interest to go and look at them on a site without a narrative. I mean, sometimes people will put 2 slides up and be the most entertaining people you've ever met, and they're brilliant, but you couldn't get anything out of the presentation. If you went back to it, you need something else. Other people are just dull. And no, that people are not going to do that. So part of this is an investment in presentation style and understanding how that process works, and collecting a body of images and ideas in terms of how that process works, and beginning to do that.
Is there any copyright issues with the images you use?
No, because I use very specifically, now in this one it's not the same, but on another one I have a full reference list of images. So in exactly the same way as I reference my citations, I reference my images. So if I've downloaded an image from Flickr, then at the back page it says slide 2, photo, their title, what it's called, where they are, and a link to them. And I've already emailed them to say, I'm using your image in a presentation, are you okay? Some of them are open commons and you can do that, and some of them aren't. So the images are not a problem, it's how we treat them. We're actually very bad at stealing images, and we just use them, and that's when the copyright comes in. But if you actually cite them as you would a paper, then it's absolutely fine. And when you click on a photo, you look at the license, you can understand what it is you can do with it. I also very occasionally, I have an account on iStock Photo. So if I really can't find the image I want, so this photo here, I bought because I decided it was an investment. It was probably about £2. But it said what I wanted it to say. Now that's a personal decision to do that. Most of the images come from Flickr or whatever, but they're cited.
So this isn't that different to what Inessa's doing within, she's got hers within her own package.
Yes.
Of here's an image, here's a bit of words, go a little bit further, go a little
Yes.
bit further. You've got across different platforms.
Yes.
So you've got Slideshow, which has got that, you've got something else which has got a statement.
Yeah.
In fact, Slideshow has some statements.
Yeah.
For which then paper comes follows.
Yeah.
It's just yours are disaggregated, whereas in Letters they're...
Yeah, but using different platforms to do it, so we're moving platforms. But yes, it's achieving it. It's the repeated ideas. And what I've tried to do over 4 years is to get people to trust me, so that what I'm talking about is bona fide, and I'm an academic who talks to practitioners, but I also used to be a practitioner, so I understand, you know, and it's the language you use and it's the way that you do it. And it takes time, but now it doesn't take me so much time, because it's one of those things you get used to it. And we were talking before, and as Andrew said, you almost need to lurk on Twitter, and so you just need to sit there and listen to conversations. Some of the best people I know didn't say a word for 6 months. They just listened, and they understood who were the people who were saying things that they liked, who were people they could engage in a debate with, not actually doing it. And then suddenly there'd be an opportunity to respond to a tweet, and then it would start. And you know, and that's why it's important that you don't go in and hammer someone. You know, I've got a colleague, as I said before, who is quite aggressive on Twitter. And if a teacher makes a comment, he goes, "Oh, that's rubbish, there's no proof." And you're like, "Whoa, you can say that in 6 or 7 tweets time." But you've got to encourage people to get engaged, because we have to understand, from my perspective, there's no point putting research out if it doesn't change practice at all. So sometimes you have to understand what the things are. And we know we're doing research now on Twitter and how using Twitter and engaging with blogs informs changing practice. So we're beginning to look at that as a process. So, you know, if you download my paper or you read my blog, is it just entertaining? Well, that's fine. Does it challenge you to think about anything? Does it require you to take things differently? And we're beginning to look at that in terms of how we analyse. So my blog's been visited by 100,000 people. Now that's a discussion. And this is mine, which was professionally designed, but I got funding to do this. So I started with, and we're going to talk about later, I started with a basic website you can get for free, and then because it got success, we took it from there. My podcast has had 10,000 visitors in a year and over 4,000 downloads. So what I do is I write a weekly blog on research in physical education. So I take it from a practitioner's view, and then I summarize the paper in about 700 words. So I reflect on it, how it would work, and then I try to give what I think is the basic take-home message from the paper. And I've done that for nearly 2 years, and I've done 92 papers. And in the last year, I decided to simultaneously publish that as a podcast, because some people actually sat on the bus want to listen to it, but they can't actually have time to read it. So it's exactly the same day, slightly scripted differently, but that comes out on the same day. And at the beginning of that week, that was in the top 1,000, and there are like 40,000 podcasts on there. And of course, there'll be some that are derelict and don't work anymore. And it was in the top 32 for education or something. So, you know, you're beginning to develop a portfolio, and that's how I kind of do it. And that's it. Did I go fast enough? Right, okay.